Hello again. From the Momoyama period, I am going to continue to the next, historical time of Japan, known either as the Edo or Tokugawa period. Present-day Tokyo was called Edo back then, and 1603 was when Tokugawa Ieyasu rose to power and the capital was moved to Edo. Historians may prefer to call it the Tokugawa period, based on the family name of the rulers that was able to maintain peace for almost 250 years. I spoke about the Christian persecution last, which was an important segment of history that occurred at the end of the Momoyama period and into the Edo period. But then as the Edo period begins, there are three other key features to this time in Japanese history, which were installed by the shogunate in an attempt to maintain the Pax Tokugawa or Tokugawa peace. First of all, society was organized according to 4 levels, according to Chinese Confucian beliefs. And the order was as follows. The samurai were at the top tier of this system here. And in this 4-print series here, this is about the 4-tier system. So here are the samurai. The samurai now are mostly bureaucrats because there are no more wars to fight. Second were the peasant class or farmers, because they were important producers of agriculture and most of all of rice, which was the measure of counting wealth. And so the wealth of a domain depended on how much rice they would be able to produce. Third were the artisans, because they were still producers or makers. And then at the bottom of this social scale were merchants, because they were dealing with money. And according to Confucian beliefs, this was disdained upon. However, what happened was that because they were dealing in money, the merchant class becomes the most lucrative, of course, and they thrive. And this is what leads to this time of the chonin, or the townspeople. Now, beyond the 4 levels, there was the imperial family always, and aristocrats. And then beneath, there were the eta, who were either condemned due to their occupation, such as tanners who skinned and killed animals and handled carcasses. And this went against Buddhist and Shinto religious values. And the hinin, which translates into non-humans, and they were people such as criminals, street peddlers, and even actors, or those who entertained belonged to this class, if you will, of people. So the system actually ended up working in favor of the merchants. Here we go. Okay. Now, second, in 1635, the mandatory alternate attendance system, or sankin kotai, was put into place. This was essentially a hostage system whereby the daimyo, or lords of domain, had to maintain a residence in Edo, the capital, in addition to their castles in their own domains. This was an annual affair that required the daimyo to spend a year in their home domain and then go back to Edo, where their wives and children were kept captive. So it was essentially a hostage system, and this was the way the shogunate kept track of feudal lords in check to make sure they did not accumulate too much wealth, since these journeys could be very costly. So here is a print from the following Meiji period that shows a daimyo procession. So here is the head of this procession, and these are all his retainers and men carrying things for him here too. And then the daimyo himself would have been in this fancy palanquin. What happened as a result of this was that actually some of the major roads of Japan developed, such as the Tokaido, which is the route between Tokyo and Kyoto. Finally, in 1639, the Sakoku Seisaku, or national isolation policy, was put into place, making Japan a mostly closed country. This meant that no Japanese could leave Japan and no foreigners were allowed casual entry. So please recall that at the end of the Momoyama period, we have the Westerners who were basically mostly Christian, although there were traders as well. But once the national isolation policy is put into place, the only foreigners that were allowed entry were the Koreans, Chinese, and the people from the Ryukyu kingdom. And then the Dutch were the only Westerners allowed because they were the only ones who were purely traders. They had this route called the Dutch East India Company, a big trading route around the world. And they had no Christian agenda whatsoever. So the shogunate was almost paranoid about Christianity by this time. This is a picture of Nagasaki Harbor. So the ships would sail in this way. So again, the southern winds would bring them in here. And then here you can see 2 Dutch ships in the harbor. The Chinese had their own compound. The Koreans had their own compound. So everybody, all the foreigners were relegated to their own areas where they could stay once they were in Nagasaki. But the Dutch were confined to this little island here, which jutted out, called Deshima Island, which literally means an island sticking out. If you go to Nagasaki today, they have recreated this island, so you can sort of get a feel for what it might have been like back then. Nagasaki is a wonderful place to visit because there are some Chinese temples there, because with the fall of the Ming Dynasty in China, there was a group of Buddhist monks who basically fled this way and established some temples in this area. Okay, this is a detail from a set of hand scrolls that shows the Dutch settlement, and then we'll be looking at the Chinese settlement. But so this would have been what life was like on Deshima, and they've recreated this structure basically. So you can see the foreigners here, exotic animal like this ostrich. And then you can see that the foreigners are seated upstairs at tables and chairs, having their Western meal, their hats hanging here. And then over here, there are some musicians and a Japanese samurai with a sword. And they are standing on a tatami mat floor. And if you do go to Japan today, you would quickly learn that having any kind of even slippers on tatami mat floors are a big no-no. Here you can see musicians, and you see the darker skin tone means that they were probably from Batavia, Java, which is current day Indonesia, and that would have been the last port before the Dutch ships entered to Japan. This is a detail from the scroll that shows the Chinese settlement, and we know these are Chinese figures because of the way they're dressed, and also because of their hats, which were so prominent during the Qing dynasty in China. And they also have their queues, their long pigtails. And then also, as an art historian, of most interest to me is that they are actually displaying Chinese-style ink paintings on the walls behind them. These were coveted items at this time because trade was so limited. Japanese artists were there was a group of them very keen on anything Chinese culture, classics, painting, so forth. All right. Okay. Right. So, the combination of such societal factors and restrictions led to the flourishing of Edo, which by the 18th century was the largest cosmopolitan area in the world, with over 1 million residents already. Today, when you visit Tokyo, the imperial residence is in the middle of the town, but back then, Edo Castle was in the center, and around it were the daimyo families, which would have been considered uptown, and the merchants lived downtown, which would have been more to the east. A market economy as we know it today developed during this time. A lot of shops became established, some of which even continue to this day. And basically, the merchants made a lot of money. Art production mirrored such developments, whereas paintings previously during the Momoyama period focused around powerful rulers and warlords to adorn their castle residences and the major temples as well. By the 18th century in Japan, there was an outburst of creativity in terms of paintings. And the patrons were not only the rulers and aristocrats anymore, but they were wealthy merchants, sometimes artisans, peasants, probably not so much, but there were people, there was a little social mobility between some of the classes, like a painter could have been from a farming family. All right. So, for example, there is this artist, Soga Shohaku, who has been labeled as eccentric by scholars of the 20th century. Shohaku is very popular in this day and age, especially with young people. When they have had Shohaku exhibitions, they've been very, very successful. Works by him, as you see on the screen now, are popular for his brushwork and compositions that are quite expressive and dynamic, as you can see here. These are actually huge panels, originally Fusuma sliding door panels that have been restored and remounted about 10 years ago at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And they have the largest collection of Japanese paintings outside of Japan, and the largest collection of Shohaku paintings outside of Japan as well. Each panel is actually about 6 feet tall by 4 feet wide, and these would have been used as Fusuma sliding doors in a large temple hall. I've enlarged. Here is a detail of the dragon's face. You can see how Shohaku creates quite the expression on the dragon's face, by the way. He strategically creates the eyes, especially in the way he places the pupils oh so precisely, in almost a cross-eyed manner. Combine this with the way he drew the scales on the dragon's head, which are beyond exaggerated with pointy, craggly shapes that form the head. As you can further see, the waves where the tail of the dragon swish through show so much motion and adds to the dynamism to the work, which is further enhanced by the ominous 4 claws of the dragon that you see to your far left. Now, again, one must finally imagine being in a room where these are actually sliding doors that serve as walls while being mobile as well. Rimpa. I want to talk a little bit more about Japanese design and the school commonly called the Rimpa school. Rin comes from the artist's name Ko Rin, and Pa simply means school up, and therefore you have the term Rimpa. This pair of screens by Tawaraya Sotatsu is from the early 17th century. Today, we take these types of compositions for granted, but at the time, it was a radically new way of depicting religious Buddhist figures, the gods of winter and the god of winter and the god of thunder. What was radical is the way in which Sotatsu places the figures in the corners and maximizes the effect of the negative space which is the blank areas around them, to create the dramatic effect of these gods approaching us from the heavens. In the interest of time, I am not going to make anecdotal comments. Now, about 100 years later, Ogata Korin takes Sotatsu's concepts and revitalizes them in his own ways. This pair of screens is one of my personal all-time favorites. Korin creates a stunning design by placing the plum trees to the far right and left of the compositions, and then visually adjoins them by the river that flows in between. Furthermore, the water is super stylized in the curly circular ways he renders the flowing water, like that. Korin and his brother Kenzan actually lived and worked in Kyoto and were part of this world of artisans and merchants because their family owned a textile shop supplying fabrics and garments to the wives of the Tokugawa rulers. With the decline of the family wealth, Korin and Kenzan had to become producers, and while Korin designed textiles and painted hanging scrolls and screens, Kenzan became a potter. They often collaborated as well, and these are examples of some of Kenzan's works. Now, here is one more example of a beautiful screen, which is actually at the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. Korin takes a single motif, the iris, and by placing it, and by repeating it, creates a rhythmic pattern with it and maximizes on the effect of the gold ground, just like Sotatsu did. He doesn't draw a ground, but by this very deliberate placement of the iris leaves or stalks, we know that they are rooted to the ground and not floating in space. Although the sense of perspective might be unfamiliar to us, kind of flat looking, the zigzag black planks are actually those of a low bridge, and a culturally informed person of the Edo period would immediately know that this image is capturing a moment from the Japanese classic, The Tales of Ise, which is about the 9th century courtier, Ariwara no Narihira. I don't have a detail to show you, but the purple of the irises are actually done very carefully, and they're not one solid color, but they're about 3 colors. When you see colors like this in Japanese painting, please know that the colors are made by pigments, so they're not oils or tempera, etc., or watercolors, but they're you have to, you'll see some examples later, but for example, the green would have been malachite, the blue would have been azurite, cinnabar would be red, white would have been oyster shells that were all graded down and then mixed with water, and then there would have been a sizing applied to the surface, and the sizings tended to be animal glue. So all these pigments were mineral based, which also meant that you couldn't manipulate them to create shading. So you had to actually, how do I explain it? They were flat areas of color, and not, it was hard to manipulate it like watercolors. Although here, the sumi ink has been manipulated. This technique is called tarashikomi. It's sort of like if you take a paper towel and you drop ink on it and it bleeds on the surface. It's that kind of effect where you allow the ink to naturally puddle and pool. But anyway, that was a technique that the artists of the Rimpa school perfected. Okay. Another 18th century painter before moving on to ukiyo-e prints. Maruyama Okyo may not be quite as popular today because his paintings tend to look a lot more traditional, but he was another Kyoto painter who was tremendously successful and prolific in his day. In fact, he produced so many students, and he had quite a stable of painters in his studio. This is probably one of his most famous of his masterpieces, called Pine Trees in the Snow. Ukiyoe is known as a naturalist who turned actually to observing nature instead of just studying past masters' works like they did in the Kano school that I mentioned in the Momoyama lecture. So Kano painters, when you entered the Kano school, like Ukiyoe originally did train on, oh no, he didn't. But anyway, if you trained under a Kano painter, you would be studying like in the Edo period, you would look back to what Eitoku was painting and then kind of copy them and sketch them. But Ukiyoe was different. He wanted to look to nature and see what he could come up with. There were also painters by this time who felt that East Asian methods were not conducive to creating realistic works, trying to copy the three-dimensional world around us onto a two-dimensional surface. So there were artists like Tani Buncho and Hiraga Gennai here, who experimented with Western painting. Buncho saw an actual painting by the Dutch artist Van Rooyen, and he copied it the best that he could with what materials he had. Hiraga Gennai, we don't know what he saw, but he must have seen some portrait of some Western woman and tried to make his own rendition of it using traditional pigments again. And so his lady is really awkward looking. And you might remember the little baby Jesus and how awkward he was. But again, this artist is having a problem kind of building up this area of the woman's body. And you can see that her eyes are really exaggerated. And he, you have to give him a lot of credit. He is totally unfamiliar with trying to paint in a Western realistic manner. Back to my story on Ukiyoe. Ukiyoe, on the other hand, is very subtle in his approach and therefore very successful. He doesn't do anything to jar his audience, but he does have this idea that he wants to create a dimensional thing on the two-dimensional surface. And so he tries to do his own version of shading, which is to use this technique to have the edges of the tree trunks darker, and then to have the snow in the middle lighter, therefore giving a sense of real volume to the tree. And he does the same thing with the pine needles and how the snow falls on them, leaving the edges of the needles dark. So you get the feeling of the weight of the snow on the trees. He also takes branches and kind of exaggerates the zigzag nature of them, more than what just Eitoku did in the ink paintings that we saw by him in the Momoyama period. And like here, he is definitely trying to create the illusion of this branch going into the background, receding into space, and trying to use atmospheric perspective, showing that this is definitely in the foreground, rooted right there. This is in the foreground, that is in the foreground, but this is in the background, and that is in the background as well. He paints the rolling hill here, so we know again that these trees are grounded and not just floating in space. Ukiyoe, earlier in his career, we know that he worked for a toy store and he painted faces on dolls. And also he made these pictures called optical pictures, or Ukiyoe, floating pictures. If you have been to Kyoto, maybe you visited the Sanju Sangendo or the hall with 33 bays. It's known for its really, really long architectural structure of 33 bays, and for the archery contests that they have been holding there for centuries. But here, Ukiyoe, having seen some examples of copperplate etchings from the West and maybe some drawings from China, exaggerates the sense of perspective. Perspective during the Renaissance, by the 14th and 15th century, was scientifically calculated to a single vanishing point. The Japanese artists did not know how to do this, but they did this visually. So they copied what they saw. And so if you were to draw grid lines on Okyo's picture here, it's not going to get arranged scientifically precisely, but you still achieve the same effect. Now, a picture like this goes into a box like this called a Dutch trick looking box, a karakuri box. And that was what you would have seen. So I think you get a sense of this kind of fascination at the time. You know, it would have been like they'd peek in, and you have to remember that they didn't have anything comparable to looking at things in total perspective at the time. All right, so this brings me to my transition to the world of ukiyo-e prints and the world of the chonin, or the townspeople. So this is the latter half of my presentation. During the Edo period, there truly was a blossoming of the chonin, or townspeople, of merchants, artisans, and entertainers. Even painters like Korin and Okyo were part of this world, making beautiful art for patrons who were often wealthy merchants by this time. Woodblock prints were made for the lowest level of society, the merchant class, and for the masses, basically for people who could not afford to buy prints. But by the late 19th century, they were already being collected in the West, and all major museums all over the world have them in their collections now. In fact, Christie's just had an auction in New York, and they sold some great prints for some great prices. Woodblock printmaking was a collaborative process, which was driven by first a publisher, and then an artist would make the initial drawing for the finished print. So when I say a name like Hokusai or Hiroshige, they were prominent painters of their day who drew the initial designs for the finished prints. Commonly depicted themes in prints were associated with the pleasure quarters of Edo, or the Yoshiwara, where you had courtesans, and actors of the Kabuki theater, which the theaters were also located on the outskirts of town. So earlier prints tended to depict these themes, and later, by the middle of the 19th century, landscapes and travel-related themes also became popular as roads between the major cities became well established, and there was more people traveling within Japan, not just the daimyo processions crisscrossing across the country. So here is a triptych from a series that shows a parody of the 4 levels of society that I mentioned at the top of this presentation. By a triptych, I mean that 3 sheets of paper are used to create one single image. The sizes of these sheets were also regulated by the government, as were subject matters. So this is a parody of the artisans class, and it is a parody because in real life, it would have been men and not women making woodblock prints. The woman at the top right is the artist who draws a design. Here, the drawing is handed over to the woman to her left, who is the woodblock carver. And the carver needs to carve a block for each color that needs to be printed. So you can see here behind her the blocks that have been lined up. The woman next to her on the right is, well, kind of, I guess to her left, is getting the sheet of paper ready for printing, the printing will be done by the woman at the far left, waiting for the sheet to come her way, and she already has her block. It looks like she's going to print the color red right now because she has her block ready with the red ink. And here are the pigments, the different trays of the colors that have been turned into paints diluted with water, and then the brushes that she would have used. And these are called the bareng, and bareng are circular objects that you rubbed on the print to get the colors printed evenly and nicely. All right. This is another triptych from the same series, and this time it is parodying the merchant class. Again, it is a parody because the women are all the merchants, when in actuality it would have been men, mostly men in the shop selling the prints. If you look really closely, I think you can tell that the prints being sold all look like they're actually Kabuki actor prints. And this is very funny because Kunisada was a prolific artist who made many designs of Kabuki actors. And so I think he's being a little tongue-in-cheek by being the creator of this picture, but also including himself into it. Furthermore, if you see here, that is the same as this here, the red cartouche with the yellow squiggly do on the top right, which was the way Kunisada signed his works. He signed them Toyokuni ga because his name was Utagawa Kunisada, but he was actually Utagawa Toyokuni the third. Please also keep in mind that all the writing that you see here, that's like the title of the series, the artists, you have censorship seals, and then also the publisher seals. They were all carved into the blocks and not written in afterwards. Here is what is called a key block, and this one is by Kitagawa Utamaro. A key block is a block that is printed in the beginning. So the artist draws the picture, and then the carver carves out just the lines, and then you print in black just the lines, and that becomes the key block. So at the bottom right corner is this marker, and that's how they would line up the sheet to each of the blocks every time in order to get the registration correct. So here is the version of the finished print. Here's a picture of an artisan working, probably in the last century at this point. But so there are some people that continue to make woodblock prints in Japan, but then it's not a collaborative process anymore, but it's one person doing the whole job from beginning to end. On the lower left is the circular instrument called the baren that he would use to rub the ink onto the papers. I'm going to show you 3 prints by Kitagawa Utamaro. Where am I? So initially, you know, prints had like 2 colors first. They were hand painted, and then there's an artist that comes up with maybe 4 or 5 colors. And yes, this palette by Utamaro is pretty subdued, and maybe you can count 5 or 6 colors. A lot of these colors are really fugitive to light. So if you happen to own any of them, never display them in direct sunlight. But Utamaro was popular for his prints showing beautiful women, bijin. And he was known to capture women at specific moments. So here we have the courtesan, Hanaogi, who is, you know, popular, and that's why men would have wanted a picture of her. And she's holding it's either a sheet of paper, perhaps, with some fancy printing on it. And it's just a moment. It's almost like a photographic moment that she is captured in. Please also notice her hair, very beautifully done. I once worked with a hairdresser from a hairstylist, I guess you say, from Kyoto, who was trained by a traditional wig maker to recreate all these hairstyles. And I also learned that women at the time did in fact use some sort of oil um, to stiffen their hair, and they also had extensions, and they also had I don't know what you call them, but it's like tufts of hair that they put inside to hold up certain styles. Scholars are also able to sort of identify or date prints sometimes from the specific kinds of hairstyles. Here is another print by Utamaro of a woman that has just finished her bath. Now here we see a little breast exposed, which was extremely unusual. There's a whole category of prints called the shunga, which are basically pornographic prints. And you see plenty of skin in that type of prints, which I'm not showing to you today, relevant to our talk. But ordinarily, this was very unusual. You did not see this too often. But again, Utamaro has captured a slight moment where a woman who has just come up from her bath, her hair is still wet, as you can see it just roughly put together, and she's holding a towel. She's going to wring it out, and she's just turned her head. Boom. Finally, here is a print of a woman bathing her little baby boy. Another, a scene from daily life, if you will. So Utamaro did pictures of famous courtesans or popular younger women that worked in the tea houses, but also he did lots of prints like this where they were just capturing moments, ordinary moments. I am now going to turn to the Kabuki Theater. This is another wonderful recent acquisition by the Metropolitan Museum. It's really nice that we have the Met in New York City. In the beginning, Kabuki was performed only by women on the riverbanks of the Kamo River in Kyoto. Today, I hope you know that Kabuki theater is an all-male form of theater. So the extremely feminine women being played on stage are actually done by men today. This is a wonderful screen that shows a scene just like a decade or two after that initial phase, because now we have a stage where the woman is dancing on. Here is a detail from the screen, and you can see the main, let's call her the principal dancer on stage. And here, that's like the green room backstage where other performers are preparing. And you have all these people that have gathered around to watch this performance. The resolution isn't high enough, so I couldn't get it any larger than this. But I think you can sort of get a sense of all the textile patterns that you see in this screen. And that's very typical to screens of this period from like the early 17th century, when there was this real attention to this detail of all these textile patterns. This is a print by the 18th century artist Sharaku. Sharaku is an enigmatic figure because we basically know nothing about him. All we know is that he worked for about 8 months between 1794 and 95, and he worked for the same publisher that Utamaro worked for, but that's all we know of him, about him. Some people even speculate that maybe he was Utamaro or Utamaro was Sharaku, but we really just don't know. However, Sharaku is probably one of the most recognizable artists to a Japanese person, perhaps. We see this image a lot used in commercials of various kinds, but Sharaku is mostly known for his okubi-e, which means big head pictures of kabuki actors. And here we know that this actor is from the Ichikawa Danjuro lineage because of the three concentric squares on his garment. Charaku's figures are, the facial expressions are exaggerated, but the Kabuki actors have exaggerated facial expressions, like so. So we have another print. Again, the three triple squares here too. This print is by Katsukawa Shunko, but I wanted to show you how this role continues to this day. This is Ichikawa Ebiso, and this play is called the Shibaraku, or One Moment, and it's one of the 18 favorite Japanese kabuki plays. And you can see here, this is actually a really tense moment. And he's opened, well, he gets help with the garment being opened up like that. But this is called mie. And this is a moment when the actor strikes a pose, and he will like jiggle his head just a little bit, and then they are able to move their eyeballs like this, and the audience basically goes nuts. They love it. This is an example of a perspective print, perspective picture, Ukiyoe, of a kabuki theater from 1766. Even today, going to the theater is a very long affair, but you can buy single act tickets if you just want to go for an hour and a half, let's say, or, you know. Back then, the plays went on from dawn to dusk, and so you hung out there the whole day. You ate there, your meals, and as you can see, the audience is all around, on the ground, and up on the balconies as well. And I know it's hard to tell, but way back here to the left of the stage, those are musicians, and beyond that would have been backstage. This pathway here along the left is called a hanamichi, or flower road, which is a feature that you can still see at the Kabuki Theater in Ginza or Kyoto. All right. Just a couple more prints by Utagawa Kunisada to show that I wanted you to get a sense of how these were like posters of the day. So you would buy your favorite actors' prints. You have an actor in a female role here. This actor, he's in the role of a guy called Torazo, which I translated as Tiger Guy. And that's why his kimono has tigers on them. And finally, this is just a wonderful robe. It's a little bit into the Meiji period, but I wanted to give you a tactile feel for kabuki robes that were used back then, which are basically, can be used today. And now I'm turning to the end of my talk about prints by Hiroshige and Hokusai, which are more about travel, about landscapes. So this is station number 1, or Nihonbashi, from Hiroshige's famed series called The 53 Stations of the Tokaido. As I said already, the Tokaido connects Tokyo and Kyoto, and Nihonbashi even today is considered to be the geographic center of Japan. Here, this is a daimyo procession that is about to come here. So this crowd of people are going to have to quickly go to the sides, kneel, and not make eye contact with this higher level of society that is going to come right through. This vertical series is called 100 Famous Views of Edo, and they are just wonderful designs. The Brooklyn Art Museum has one of the best sets of these in the world, but here this one is called The Sudden Shower in Ohashi, and this over here is actually by Van Gogh. Van Gogh not only Van Gogh, but a lot of the Impressionist painters in France were fascinated by these Japanese prints. These prints made their way to Europe first just as stuffing for tea, around the, in the boxes where they sent the tea. But the artists and dealers and so forth quickly recognized, oh my God, they're wonderful images. So they really take hold over there too. And Van Gogh, you can see, has even tried to imitate Japanese characters in the frame of his print. I'm sorry, in the frame painting version of this print. Here is another print from the series, and this one is really mysterious in a way because you have this woman, you don't know where she's going, whether she's finished with a party or she's going to go to a party to entertain, but you see the half, just a sliver of the lantern of her attendant, and he has a lantern as her attendant to help her lead the way through the dark. But the best versions of this print always show the wood grains of the original wood that the sheet was printed on, over, like you can see in this image at the top half in the green part. And then on the bottom, the black part, do you see the white kind of lines down there? Those are button marks because of the printer rubbing and rubbing and rubbing. And so, but that also helps create texture. Finally, I wanted to show you that the Edo life had all sorts of sense of humor about them as well. And these are called fan prints. You can see the irises on the left, beautiful, and I already talked about the iris reference. But here on the right is a group of swallows. The RISD Art Museum calls it the dancing swallows. To me, it looks like it's like a chorus of swallows, where there is a conductor here, and their mouths are open, and it's like it's the birds chirping all at once, which I often hear now that I've set up bird feeders outside. It's a cacophony, right? But here it's so cute because they're so nicely organized, and I don't think the artist means to express cacophony, but then that's the sound that I associate when I see all these birds. Now here is a fan. Totoro fan, but I wanted to show you because this part here is what is being cut out at the bottom. Okay, finally, the artist Hokusai. Hokusai was a master of design, and he was a super draftsman. He lived a really, really long life, and in his designs, there are people, but they're just sort of props. What he really wants to showcase is what he wants to showcase. And in this case, these are a couple prints from a series of waterfalls. And you can see how, especially on the left side, it's not realistic looking at all, but he doesn't care. He just wants to give you a fantastic picture. On a similar note, this is a painting in the Museum of Fine Arts, painted really the last year of his life. He moved like almost every year during his long life, and he also liked to sign his works in many different ways. And at this later time in his life, he signed his paintings Gakyo Rojin, which can be translated as old man crazy about painting. And so I just wanted to show this painting. It's just really wonderful. And then these are two pictures of Fuji from the series, the 36 Views of Mount Fuji. To your left is the print popularly known as the Red Fuji. And then to the right is one called Reflection in Lake at Misaka. Finally, I think you might know what's coming, but it's this print. Under the Wave of Kanagawa, popularly called the Great Wave. Now, you would forget that the focal point of this print is supposed to be Fuji, because it's a series about Mount Fuji. But Hokusai doesn't care. He just gives you this great composition. Um, it's about the great wave. And the people have been reduced to these patterns of circular heads and their bodies. And then the boats are there just to emphasize the greatness of the roaring waves. But yet he also is able to bring your attention, because of the way the spray falls, to Mount Fuji, which is just off center of the image. I mentioned that Christie's had a wonderful sale recently in like the third week of September, and you can still Google this. If you Google Christie's New York Japanese sale September, you'll get all the prints to come up. But they sold a version of this for like $1 million. You know, prints exist in multiples, but what happens is as the popularity, so it's like demand meets production. If something sells well, the publisher will say, okay, let's keep on printing. But then the print quality deteriorates because the wood, the edges of the wood start to get lost, and so the registrations are off and they're just not as nicely printed. And then, of course, you know, we just don't know what each print went through in order to be with us still today. And therefore, some prints are just extremely valuable depending on their popularity and rareness. It's not all the time. This great wave came up for sale. I want to say maybe a year ago. There were 2 of them, but I don't know if they had actually. I know they did not sell for $1 million. So there must have been something really special about the version that sold this time. I think that takes us right up to about 50 minutes. So I am going to go ahead and say goodbye. Thank you very much. And I look forward to meeting you all in person in a couple weeks. Goodbye and have a nice weekend.